Joining me now is Matt Siegelman. He is a fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law and the co-author of the upcoming How to Steal a Presidential Election, which hits shelves on Tuesday, and Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor of history at NYU and author of Strong Men, From Mussolini to the President. Matt, I want to start the conversation with you about the 14th Amendment. You agree with Supreme Court watchers when you say that the court basically looks like it's going to hand Donald Trump a victory in this case. But you also say that there could be a silver lining for Jack Smith's election interference case. Can you please explain that? What do you mean?
That's right, and thanks for having me. It seems absolutely clear that the Supreme Court is going to reject the attempt to bar former President Trump from the ballot on the basis of his disqualification as an insurrectionist. But critically, the basis of its decision, based on the oral arguments on Thursday, will not be that he didn't engage in insurrection. They're going to rule, most likely, that states don't have the power to do that it has to be Congress that takes him off the ballot. But what that leaves open is whether he engaged in insurrection. And that's the key critical issue in the D.C. election subversion case from Jack Smith.
Ruth, the 14th Amendment argument staying there, that was always going to be an extreme measure to remove Trump. But if you think about the actions that led to that, everything on January 6th, that was also extreme. There were people who died. His supporters stormed the Capitol. They chanted about literally hanging the vice president of the United States of America. You are someone who has done a deep dive on extremism and strong language and rhetoric and what that means for political discourse. How do we as a nation insulate ourselves or protect ourselves from what can result if we will not use the protections that seem to already exist against these sorts of extreme measures?
Yeah, it's tragic because it plays into everything that Donald Trump is about. You know, authoritarianism at its essence is about removing restraints on bad actors, allowing the leader and his enablers to get away with any kind of crimes. And so, you know, this is sending a message to everyone who doubts our justice system. The idea that there's doubt whether he incited an insurrection, it plays into the information warfare tactic that, you know, did January 6th really happen other than as a riot? Did people really die? All of this is important. And you likened this to a novel. And indeed, unfortunately, so far, there's the legal battle and there's the information war. And it seems like Trump is winning that, both from the polls, and the more openly dictatorial he becomes, the more threatening he becomes, the more he is lionized by the press, the mainstream press, not just Fox News, and lionized by his devotees in and out of Congress.
Ruth, one of the things that we've been talking about is this poll that suggests that a conviction could change the mind and sway certain voters. Putting aside the notion that they would need an actual conviction to sort of make that determination, I wonder, does that statistic, the fact that people will say, well, if he's convicted, then that could change my vote, does that give you some sort of sense that the public or part of the electorate is sort of changing its mind, or at least seeing that, hey, we could be headed to a particularly bad place?
It does. And I want to say that the behavior of Trump, his lawyers, GOP enablers in the courts, in Congress, it's all designed to delegitimize democratic model of justice, to show open scorn and contempt for those professional ethics. Think of Justice Thomas refusing to recuse himself. This is scorn and contempt. And so it's interesting, these polls that show that conviction could make a difference, because it shows that Americans still have faith in the weight of the justice system, that a conviction would mean something. And in other countries, either bans or convictions of bad actors who were leaders do mean something. In Italy, after Berlusconi was convicted 2 years after he left office, his party popularity plummeted and his personality cult deflated. And in Brazil, Bolsonaro was disqualified by being banned from office after his January 8th insurrection. And so they can no longer be relevant on the national stage. So conviction is absolutely key to all of this.
Matt, I want to have some lawyer talk really quickly. You were counsel in one of the entities that filed an amicus brief in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals immunity case, and you got a pretty good win from that. Can you talk to our audiences about the significance of that going forward and what that means, not just for Donald Trump, but just generally speaking? Were there any other takeaways that you got from that opinion that you feel have larger implications around protecting our government and our citizens?
Yeah, it's an enormously consequential decision. It's tightly reasoned, and I think it'll definitely hold up on appeal in the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court even decides to take the case. And it's critically important for the general principle that we're all equal under the law. It's important to recognize just how radical former President Trump's position is. At oral argument, Judge Pan asked a hypothetical. Would former President Trump have been immune from criminal prosecution if he had ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his political rivals? And the answer from Trump's lawyer was yes. And we need to pause and think about what that would mean for American society if the president was completely immune from any kind of criminal accountability, no matter what he did, including assassinations. That's the road that Trump and his lawyers want us to go down. And I think it's heartening in these really challenging times that a unanimous D.C. Circuit rejected that. And so it wasn't just Biden appointees, it was also Republican appointees. Judge Henderson, who's a quite conservative judge, joined the unanimous opinion for the court. And I expect the Supreme Court will reject the position as well.
Matt, I think I tend to agree with you. I don't even know that, given the tightly reasoned opinion that came out of the circuit, that is going to even be touched by the Supreme Court. I actually am betting my smart money that it won't. Ruth, so we have this sort of scale I want to deal with. Like Matt was just talking about, you have this great opinion, this tightly, very well-reasoned opinion that came out of the Court of Appeals in D.C. that basically strikes down this notion of an immunity claim. And then on the other hand, you have looming what many are anticipating is going to be a Supreme Court case and opinion that more or less allows Trump to remain on the ballot. From your perspective, in terms of how you've studied autocrats and dictators and strongmen, if you will, where does the balance fall in terms of, does this emerge, from this, do we see a stronger, more emboldened Donald Trump emerge, depending on which way the scale tilts, or someone who's kind of sort of beleaguered and embattled?
Again, there's the legal battle, and then there's the information warfare battle. And Trump will take any opportunity that shows that his claims might indeed have, hold water to keep his personality cult going, saying he's invincible, he can do whatever he wants. His last speech, he's now saying, when he says this speech about NATO and Putin, that, Putin can do whatever the hell he wants. This is the fantasy of the autocrat, to get into power or get back into power and arrange government so that you can do anything and pay no consequences. And, a Supreme Court that does not be very, vehement in upholding democracy and saying there are restraints on the leader, there have to be, is a Supreme Court that is not, in the end, acting as a friend to democracy.
Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Matt Schlegelman, thank you both for being here.